It began with a voice. A trembling, distant voice carried through broken radios across Asia and the Pacific, soft, formal, and yet heavy enough to silence an empire. On August 15, 1945, millions of Japanese soldiers stopped in their tracks as Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people for the very first time. The words were calm, but their meaning was catastrophic. The Empire of Japan had surrendered. For nearly 15 years, from the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 to the Pacific War's end, Japan had been told it was invincible, guided by divine destiny, unstoppable, and protected by the spirit of the emperor himself. To most Japanese soldiers, he wasn't merely a ruler. He was sacred, his will was unquestionable, his image untouchable. So when his voice finally broke the static that morning, fragile and human, soldiers frowned in disbelief. Many couldn't even understand the courtly language he used, but one phrase echoed everywhere: "We must endure the unendurable." It was over. The men who had once sworn to die for the emperor Saturday in silence, staring at the ground. Some wept openly, others stood motionless, their hands trembling on rifles that now had no meaning. A few quietly walked into the jungle, determined to end their lives rather than live with the shame of surrender. They had been taught that surrender was worse than death. It wasn't just defeat, it was spiritual collapse. The ancient Bushido code demanded loyalty unto death. Captivity was dishonor. And yet, here they were, ordered to lay down their arms. Across the ruins of Asia and the islands of the Pacific, Allied forces began moving in. American soldiers expected ambushes, suicide attacks, and traps. They had seen it before. But what they found instead was something no one predicted: soldiers with hollow eyes, bones showing through their skin, uniforms hanging like rags, and hands raised not in defiance, but in surrender. The Japanese troops had been starved by war and disease. Their supplies were gone, their leaders silent, their hope extinguished. Yet even in that moment of defeat, many bowed to their captors out of habit, or perhaps respect for the formality of soldiers. The Americans didn't know what to make of it, neither did the Japanese. For years, propaganda on both sides had built monsters out of men. Japanese children had been told that American soldiers were demons, beasts who burned, tortured, and devoured. Mothers warned their children that if captured, they would be mutilated. Soldiers were told that Americans would show no mercy. And so, when the first groups of captured soldiers saw American boots stepping through the mud toward them, they braced for the end. They expected execution. But instead, something unexpected happened. The first American soldier they met didn't raise his rifle. He offered water. A medic moved from one prisoner to another, bandaging wounds that had festered for weeks. He didn't speak Japanese, and they didn't speak English, but kindness doesn't need translation. The prisoners sat in stunned silence as enemy hands treated them with care they hadn't even received from their own army. Later that day, they were given food, bread, coffee, and soup, things that smelled unfamiliar and foreign. Many refused to eat at first. They thought it was a trick. One survivor later recalled, "I believed they wanted to mock us before killing us, but they only smiled and told us to eat. When I finally tasted the white bread, I cried. It was soft, warm, like nothing I had known since my childhood." For the first time in years, these men, once warriors of a collapsing empire, sat quietly around a meal, realizing that their captors were not monsters at all. When word of surrender reached the homeland, Japan itself was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ashes. Tokyo was a skeletal ruin of twisted metal and burned wood. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were unthinkable shadows burned into walls, silence hanging over entire neighborhoods. Returning soldiers stepped off ships or trains into cities they couldn't recognize. Their families were gone, homes destroyed, the empire erased. Many feared American occupation would mean slavery or annihilation. Instead, they found order, discipline, and even protection. General Douglas MacArthur, who led the Allied occupation, issued strict orders: no abuse, no revenge, no humiliation of the defeated. American soldiers were told to act as guardians, not conquerors. For many Japanese, this was the first true shock of surrender. Their enemy had won with unimaginable power, yet treated them with restraint and dignity. Japanese officers who once commanded thousands now stood in lines, heads bowed, handing over their ceremonial swords. They expected ridicule. Instead, the Americans accepted the weapons with formal salutes, a gesture of respect that left many speechless. One officer wrote in his diary, "I thought I would die before this day came, but when the American took my sword, he saluted me. I could not understand. I felt my hatred slipping away." In the countryside, American patrols moved through small towns and villages. At first, the people hid indoors, terrified, but soon, they began to see something strange: soldiers distributing food, rebuilding bridges, clearing rubble from schools. Children peeked from behind broken fences, and American soldiers smiled, offering chewing gum and chocolate bars, tiny, sweet symbols of peace. For the returning Japanese soldiers, who had fought in jungles and caves, this was almost unbearable to watch. They had been prepared for a glorious death in defense of the emperor. Instead, they were alive and being helped by the very enemy they were told to hate. That contrast between everything they had been taught and what they were now witnessing tore through their minds. Some called it mercy, others called it humiliation, but all of them knew the world they had believed in was gone. Yet not every soldier accepted the truth. In the dense jungles of the Philippines, the thick forests of Indonesia, and the remote islands scattered across the Pacific, thousands of Japanese soldiers refused to believe the war was over. They thought the surrender was a lie, American propaganda designed to weaken them. These men, known later as holdouts, continued to live in isolation, waiting for orders that would never come. They built makeshift shelters, lived off roots and stolen food, and whispered prayers to a distant emperor they still believed would call them back to glory. Some held out for months, others for years. The most famous, Lieutenant Hironoda, did not surrender until 1974, 29 years after the war had ended. When he was finally persuaded to lay down his weapon, he wept. He couldn't comprehend that Japan had been rebuilt into a peaceful, thriving nation under American guidance. Imagine the shock: a man emerging from a jungle expecting war, only to find neon lights, skyscrapers, and a generation that barely remembered the empire he fought for. Back in 1945, those who had surrendered early faced a different struggle. Inside the POW camps, they found a world unlike anything they had imagined. They saw Americans treating them with a strange kind of fairness, giving equal rations, providing medical care, and enforcing discipline without cruelty. One soldier remembered the shock of seeing American guards smile. "They smiled at us," he wrote, "and it broke my heart. I realized that all my life, I had fought an illusion." The most disorienting part wasn't the loss of the war, it was discovering the humanity of the enemy. Meanwhile, Japan itself was learning the same lesson on a national scale. In the ruins of Hiroshima, American doctors treated survivors. In Tokyo, American engineers helped rebuild train lines. Farmers received seeds and tools from the same army that had once bombed their fields. The same hands that destroyed were now rebuilding. The same voices that demanded surrender now promised hope. To the Japanese mind, shaped by centuries of honor, loyalty, and hierarchy, this was almost unthinkable. Mercy was not weakness, it was power beyond comprehension. In the dim light of the occupation, a quiet transformation began. Japanese soldiers, once devoted to the sword, now watched as American soldiers played music, read books, and laughed with children. They saw a culture that prized freedom over obedience, individuality over hierarchy. And slowly, they began to understand that the real battle had never been against the Americans. It had been inside themselves, between pride and humility, hatred and humanity. One former officer later reflected, "We believed we were dying for honor, but in defeat, we discovered the value of life." By the end of that year, Japan was no longer an empire of warriors. It was a nation of survivors. The soldiers who had once shouted battle cries now planted rice, repaired homes, and learned to live under a new flag, not out of submission, but out of hope. The surrender that once felt like death was In truth, the beginning of rebirth. For the Japanese soldiers who lived through it, the greatest shock wasn't losing the war. It was realizing that their enemy's strength came not from hatred, but from humanity. The war had ended, but for the Japanese soldiers, a different kind of battle had begun, one fought not with bullets, but with understanding. In the months after surrender, thousands of Japanese prisoners of war found themselves in camps across the Pacific, in the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and even on American soil. These men had expected pain, humiliation, and starvation, but what they saw instead changed the way they understood the world forever. The first shock came from the discipline of the American camps. Every day followed a schedule: meals at fixed times, medical checkups, work duties, recreation, even classes. To men who had spent years living in chaos and fear, this order felt unreal. In Japanese camps during the war, prisoners had been beaten, starved, and treated as less than human. Yet here, American guards enforced rules with fairness: no cruelty, no random punishment. A soldier named Yasuo Takamura later recalled, "I expected to be treated as an animal, but the Americans followed their own rules. Even for prisoners, it confused me. They believed in something, a system even for enemies." The Japanese prisoners slowly began to notice small details: guards addressing them as sir, doctors speaking politely, soldiers standing at attention when officers passed, even if those officers were prisoners. There was respect for rank, even among captors and captives. For men raised in the rigid hierarchy of the imperial army, it was shocking to find respect coming from the other side of the wire. Then came the second surprise: education. In several camps, the Americans allowed Japanese prisoners to attend English lessons, lectures about democracy, and classes on science, history, and agriculture. At first, few participated. It seemed absurd learning from the enemy, but over time, curiosity replaced fear. They read about freedom of speech, the rule of law, and the concept of rights, ideas almost alien to soldiers who had been told obedience was life and questioning was treason. A POW teacher wrote, "We had been told that democracy was chaos, but I saw that Americans had order in their freedom. They respected each man's voice. It was not weakness, it was strength." The transformation was slow, quiet, and deeply personal. These were men who had been ready to die for an emperor they had never seen, now learning that respect could exist without worship, and authority without tyranny. Food, though, carried its own lessons. Every meal was a small act of humanity. Soldiers who had starved for months now received balanced rations: bread, beans, meat, vegetables, and sometimes even fruit. The Americans shared their food, sometimes joking, sometimes silent. They didn't boast, they didn't degrade, they simply fed the enemy. One Japanese soldier remembered watching an American cook preparing soup. He asked why they were giving so much food to prisoners. The cook shrugged and said, "Because you're human." That sentence, so casual and simple, struck him harder than any sermon or speech. He wrote years later, "It was the first time I realized what it meant to be treated as a man, not a tool. They had defeated us, but they still saw us." But perhaps the most unforgettable shock came from something ordinary: music. At night, when work was done, American guards often played records through loudspeakers. Yes, swing and slow love songs filled the air over the barbed wire. To the Japanese, it was the sound of another world: free, joyful, effortless. It carried no command, no order, no fear. Some prisoners closed their eyes and listened, trying to imagine the cities where this music was born. One wrote, "When I heard American music, I understood why they fought differently. They fought to protect their joy. We fought to protect our pride. That is why we lost." Months passed, and slowly, hostility gave way to strange friendships. Some Americans taught Japanese prisoners how to play baseball. Others showed them photographs of their families back home. The prisoners responded with origami, calligraphy, and polite bows. These small gestures built bridges where once there had been only hatred. Inside those camps, the impossible was happening: enemies were becoming men again. Meanwhile, in Japan itself, life under occupation was transforming the nation just as deeply. General MacArthur had turned his headquarters into the nerve center of a new Japan. The emperor, once considered divine, was now seen walking among his people, shaking hands, speaking directly, smiling for photographs. For the first time, the citizens saw him not as a god, but as a human being. That change alone shook Japan's cultural foundation. And with it came more. Women gained rights, education expanded, free press returned, and democracy was introduced. American soldiers walked the same streets that had once burned under their bombs, now carrying supplies for reconstruction. The contrast was staggering. A defeated nation being rebuilt not with chains, but with books, food, and compassion. For the soldiers watching all this unfold, it was like living in two worlds at once, the one they had fought for, and the one they were beginning to understand. In some camps, American officers even arranged debates between POWs and guards about government, justice, and morality. The Japanese soldiers struggled to explain why they had fought so fiercely for an emperor they had never met. The Americans couldn't understand blind loyalty to a single man. But through these conversations, a strange kind of respect emerged. Each side saw that the other wasn't driven by evil but by belief, culture, and circumstance. The war had been monstrous, but the men themselves were not monsters. The real shock came when repatriation began, when the Americans started sending the prisoners home. The Japanese couldn't believe they were being released. In many wars, prisoners were kept for years, used as labor or leverage, but the Americans wanted them to return, rebuild, and teach what they had learned. At the docks, some guards shook hands with the men who had once been their enemies. A few even saluted. One American sergeant gave his watch to a Japanese prisoner he'd befriended, saying, "So you'll remember that not all enemies hate." Many of those men wept openly, not from sorrow, but from confusion. How could the victors be so generous? When they boarded the ships back to Japan, the ocean breeze carried more than salt. It carried questions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What awaited them at home was another shock entirely. Their homeland had changed beyond recognition. Bombed cities were being rebuilt. American officers patrolled streets alongside Japanese police. Western clothing, music, and technology were spreading. Women walked freely. Men spoke their opinions without fear, and new newspapers filled the stands with voices once silenced. For soldiers who had grown up believing that honor came only from obedience, it was as if Japan had become another planet. At first, they felt lost, like ghosts wandering a land that no longer needed them. But gradually, they began to see what their defeat had brought: peace, opportunity, and freedom. Many veterans who had returned from American captivity became quiet advocates for change. They spoke to younger generations about what they had seen, not of American weapons, but of American hearts. They spoke of fairness, of mercy, of equality, values that once seemed foreign, now taking root in their homeland. Yet the memories of war did not vanish easily. There were moments when guilt overwhelmed them, guilt for what they had done, for the lives they had taken, for the blind faith that had led them to destruction. Some were haunted by nightmares of battles long over. Others carried photographs of fallen friends, whispering their names into the wind. But the greatest lesson many carried was this: that an enemy's compassion can be more powerful than his bombs. One former officer summarized it in his memoir: "They defeated us without hatred. That is what we could never understand, and that is why they changed us." In the years that followed, Japan transformed faster than anyone imagined. From ruins to industry, from silence to song, from despair to democracy, it rose, rebuilt not by pride, but by humility learned through defeat. And in that transformation lay the final, quiet truth. The soldiers discovered that sometimes the real victory does not belong to those who win the war, but to those who learn from it. The shock that began with surrender had turned into revelation. For the Japanese soldiers who once vowed to die for the emperor, the enemy they feared had shown them a different kind of strength, one built not on domination, but on decency. Their world had fallen, their beliefs had shattered, but from that ruin, they had glimpsed something greater than empire: humanity itself. When the ships carrying Japan's defeated soldiers finally reached home, the sight that met their eyes did not look like victory or defeat. It looked like the end of the world. Cities that had once stood proud with ancient temples and wooden streets now lay flat and gray, silent except for the wind moving through twisted metal. Tokyo was a skeleton of its former self. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were scars upon the earth. The soldiers stepped onto docks, where mothers searched faces for sons who never returned, and children stood in lines for food they might not get. For the men returning from American camps, this sight cut deeper than any bullet ever could. They had expected punishment, humiliation, perhaps even hatred from their own people, but what they saw was a quiet endurance, a nation too exhausted to hate, too hungry to fight. And yet, amid that ruin, something new was stirring. The emperor's voice, once divine, untouchable, heard only through priests and propaganda, now came to them through radio. Calm and human, he spoke of peace, of rebuilding, of cooperation with the very people who had destroyed Japan's cities. For soldiers who had once sworn to die for him, it was another shock, but this time, it was not one of pain, it was revelation. If the emperor himself could live as a man among men, then perhaps they could begin again. Within months, the occupation authorities began transforming Japan with a speed that felt impossible. Schools reopened not to teach obedience, but to teach ideas. Women voted for the first time in Japanese history. Old war factories became centers for reconstruction, and the American forces, who might have ruled as conquerors, instead worked as rebuilders. General MacArthur himself walked through devastated neighborhoods, handing candy to children who once hid from his bombers. American nurses helped treat the wounded and starving. Engineers rebuilt bridges and railways side by side with local workers. It was not the image of victors and vanquished. It was something far stranger and far more powerful. It was reconciliation. For many Japanese veterans, life after the war was a test of the soul. The Imperial Army had been their identity, their pride, their purpose. Now, stripped of rank, uniform, and flag, they were ordinary men in an extraordinary time. Some struggled to adjust. They returned to villages that no longer recognized them. Wives had aged 10 years into. Children clung to their mothers, afraid of the strangers their fathers had become. Jobs were scarce, money scarcer. Many veterans worked as farmers, construction laborers, or small merchants, anything to feed their families. But there was another battle being fought quietly in their minds, a battle between the Japan that had died and the Japan being born. One former lieutenant named Shigeru Yamashita kept a diary after his release from a U.S. camp. He wrote, "The war taught us loyalty without compassion, duty without thought, death without meaning. The Americans taught us something we had forgotten to live." He started a small school for children, teaching not just arithmetic and writing, but respect, not the blind kind taught by the military, but the mutual kind he had seen in the camps. His students grew up to become engineers, doctors, and artists in the new Japan, a generation that carried no memory of battle, only of rebuilding. Yamashita died in 1972. On his gravestone, his family engraved a simple line: "He learned humanity from his enemies." Stories like his spread quietly through the country. Veterans who had once refused to speak of the war began sharing memories not of heroism, but of awakening. They spoke of the American guards who had shown mercy, the music that had softened their hearts, the meals that had reminded them what it meant to be human. And as these stories circulated, a new kind of patriotism began to form in Japan, one not rooted in conquest, but in creation. Factories once dedicated to weapons began producing radios, bicycles, sewing machines. The same discipline that had fueled Japan's war machine now powered its industrial miracle. By the 1960s, Japan had risen from ashes to become one of the world's leading economies. Tokyo, once leveled by firebombs, hosted the 1964 Olympic Games, a symbol not of militarism, but of peace. The world that had once feared Japan now admired it, and the soldiers who had lived through both extremes, war and rebirth carried the deepest understanding of what that transformation had cost. But even in that bright new Japan, the ghosts of the past lingered. Some veterans could never escape the faces of the men they'd killed, or the friends they'd buried. Others carried private guilt for what they had done in the name of the emperor. They visited temples, offered prayers, and sat in silence for hours before small family shrines. And yet, within that sorrow, there was also gratitude not for the suffering, but for what it had revealed. They had learned that honor does not lie in dying for a cause, but in living with integrity after the cause has fallen. They had learned that strength is not found in domination, but in mercy. And they had learned that the truest victory is not the defeat of an enemy, but the defeat of hatred itself. One soldier, a former imperial pilot named Hiroshi Tanaka, visited the United States in 1970. He had been captured after his plane was shot down in the Philippines and had spent 2 years in an American camp. When he arrived in San Francisco, he sought out the family of one of the guards who had treated him kindly. He carried with him a small gift, a folded paper crane, perfectly shaped, symbolizing peace. When he met the guard's widow, he bowed deeply and said, "Your husband taught me that enemies can still be human. Japan learned peace from men like him." The woman wept. She placed the crane beside her husband's photograph. That single gesture, one man, one memory, captured everything that the war had destroyed and everything humanity had managed to restore. In the years that followed, Japan became a voice for peace on the world stage. Its constitution, written during the occupation, renounced war forever. Its diplomats became advocates for disarmament. Its industry symbols of progress. Its art and culture expressions of resilience. The sons of the men who once fought America were now building partnerships with them in trade, technology, and trust. And the daughters of those who survived the bombings filled universities and government offices, carrying forward the promise of a new age. The transformation was so complete that, within a single generation, the children of war veterans looked at their parents' stories as distant history, unimaginable, almost unreal. Yet, for those who had lived it, it was never forgotten. In his final years, General Douglas MacArthur was asked what had impressed him most about Japan after the war. He replied, "I watched a nation rise from ruin with dignity. I watched a people accept defeat and turn it into discipline. The greatest victory in Japan was not ours, it was theirs." Those words became a quiet truth across the nations that had once tried to destroy each other. So what, then, shocked the Japanese soldiers most after surrendering in 1945? It was not America's wealth, its power, or its technology. It was compassion. The simple, disarming kindness that treated them not as enemies, but as men. In a world that had drowned itself in blood and pride, they discovered something far more powerful: forgiveness. That forgiveness became the seed from which modern Japan grew. It reshaped their sense of honor, their understanding of loyalty, their very idea of what it meant to be strong. They learned that you could rebuild without vengeance, lead without cruelty, and rise without arrogance. And through them, the world learned something, too, that even in the darkest aftermath of war, humanity still has the strength to begin again. When the veterans of that generation passed away, their stories faded into history books and old documentaries, but their legacy, the bridge they built between hatred and hope, still stands, unseen but unbroken. Every time a Japanese child walks through a peaceful city, every time an American tourist visits Japan as a friend, that bridge is crossed again. And somewhere, in that quiet crossing between memory and forgiveness, the ghosts of 1945 finally rest.